Welcome everyone. This is the beginning of our third unit, and in Unit 3 and Unit 4 we're going to concentrate on the materials and tools and techniques that artists actually use in making art. So 3 is going to focus on two-dimensional materials and techniques, and Unit 4 will concentrate on three-dimensional materials and techniques. Our first big vocab term that we need to tackle is the word media. So media is the proper name for the actual physical tools and materials that artists use. So if you're thinking about what type of paint, hammer and chisel, if you're making a sculpture, these we can refer to as your media. When we use this term in singular, meaning just one, then the proper word is medium. So the word medium would imply a single material. In drawing, which is where we're going to start, we divide our media into two really big categories: dry media versus wet media. And that should be pretty obvious to you when you look at materials themselves. The dry media don't have a liquid content. They don't have to be applied with a brush. The wet media, of course, will be very runny and will have to be applied with a brush. So our dry media, the easiest basic place to start is graphite pencil, and the pencils are labeled different letter and number designations. B indicates that the pencil is soft, and a soft pencil makes a darker mark, and an H indicates the pencil is hard, and H pencils leave lighter marks. We have various types of charcoal, which is basically just superheated wood. Conte crayon and metal point round out the other dry material for essentially black, white, and gray. We do also have some dry media, including chalk pastel. The pastel in this case is held together with a binder that's made from gum arabic. It's relatively loose and very dry and dusty. It'll be similar to the chalks that you might have used as a kid if you ever did drawings on sidewalks. Oil pastels, on the other hand, same pigment, same coloring agent, but mixed with an oil-based binder, so something greasier is holding it together. Then our big category of wet media, generally speaking, I tend to classify paint in with the painting category, obviously, but some people do draw on paper using a limited range of colors, black, white, gray, for instance. So you might use paint as a drawing material, but our main and most important for the test wet media, or wet medium rather, would be ink. Ink can be diluted with water, and when we dilute the ink, we can create lighter variations of the value of the ink, and we call those diluted ink areas ink washes. So these are some examples of student grade, relatively inexpensive drawing materials. These are graphite pencils, and if you look at the bottom right, you can see I've zoomed in a little bit there on the label, and it shows you that we have an HB, a 3B, a 5B, and a 6B. So again, the letter indicates whether it's hard or soft. B is soft, H is hard. The B range soft pencils make dark marks. The H range hard pencils make light marks. But the numbering also indicates to you the degree of light or darkness. So a higher number B is going to be much darker than a lower number B. A higher number H is going to be much lighter than a lower numbered H. You have an HB slap in the middle there as well. So I took a screen grab here, or a JPEG rather, of a couple different brands of pencils being used, and I tried to draw with these using the same amount of pressure with my hand, so that you could see that at the top on the left we have a 2H. So that's a pretty light pencil. The 3B is the one in the middle, and you can see that it is a much softer, even a wider mark, and it's automatic. Look how much darker that 5B is, especially in comparison to the 2H. Also, over to the right-hand side, you can see the same concept on pencils ranging from 2H to 6B. So the letter is kind of an interesting aspect of the designations here. They actually come to us from the French. It was really French inventors who developed this system of making pencils harder and softer. So the graphite itself is the material that makes the dark mark on the page, and it basically art media inventors, people making art supplies, realized that you could kind of stretch out the amount of graphite by adding additives to it like clay. But the more additives that you put in, the more clay you added, the harder the pencil became, and the less graphite there was, the lighter the mark was. So pencils in the high numbered B range are very little additives, so there's lots of pure graphite going to make a very dark mark, and high numbered H's, a lot of additive clay, very light marks as a result. So the terms relate to the high key and low key that we learned about in the last unit. The French word for low is bas, spelled B-A-S, and the French word for high is haute, H-A-U-T-E. So B range, low range are the low key dark values. So bas is low, haute is high, so the high range, the light key, light values, are your H range pencils. The things that we use in addition to our graphite pencils that I think of as equally as important are erasers. Most people think of artists probably as having a massive amount of talent and skill that they rarely have to make corrections. But most artists that I know across the board really make art by making their mark and adjusting, changing, what you might call editing if you were working on a novel or a short story, if you were thinking about any other form. There are a lot of steps toward arriving at a final product. And so with drawing, one of the things that helps us to edit and arrive at our final work. So we have two main kinds. What you can see on the screen is a kneaded eraser, and I put a little arrow there so you can see what it looks like after you've been using it a while, which is sort of looks like a wad of chewing gum. But the way it looks when it comes out of the package is usually a flat-ish square or rectangle of gray. On the right-hand side, I have an acrylic eraser or rubber eraser that I use to get really fine marks. You can almost get back down to the white of the paper using those white plastic erasers. The kneaded erasers, though, are awesome because they can be shaped. You can roll it or pinch it into a really small cone or a small area. You can also do a trick with it that I find really useful. You can flatten it out kind of like a pancake and then press it into the surface of your drawing instead of scrubbing it back and forth or rubbing it. Just by pressing it in firmly and peeling it back off, you can remove a layer of graphite or charcoal from the top surface of your drawing without smudging your lines. And so you can lighten an area without removing your line work. So a very useful tool to have as well. We've already looked at the idea of hatching and cross-hatching, but here again is a cross-hatched drawing in graphite pencil by a Cape Fear student. And then our charcoal category, charcoal materials that we're looking at here, the ones that most people tend to like because they're a little less messy are the charcoal pencils. And charcoal pencils come in a couple forms. On the left-hand side, you see charcoal that's inside of a sheath like a graphite pencil, but the inner material is much softer and, of course, much, much darker. The type next to that is of charcoal pencil that has a fabric or paper rather wrapping around the stick of charcoal itself. And the way that those are quote unquote, you see that little white thread next to it. You can see it more clearly at the bottom right. Here you go. You pull this thread downward and that breaks the paint coating around the outside, and then you can peel away this paper, and as you unwrap the paper it exposes more of the charcoal. So that's a way of sharpening the material without having to use a pencil sharpener. In either case though, the charcoal pencil is really great for doing line work and for making really dark marks without getting yourself completely covered in charcoal dust. The Marks made by a charcoal pencil of whatever type, though, are a little bit harder to erase. So I usually save the pencil for my final details and fine elements rather than starting off with it. I tend to draw a lot with these materials. This is compressed charcoal, and compressed charcoal is the same chemical makeup as what's in a charcoal pencil, except without the coating around the outside. This is superheated wood that's been compressed and flattened into rectangular solid, like bricks. You can buy them singly or in sets of 2 or 3. The largest group is usually 12 in a box. They last a really long time because you don't need an enormous amount of this material. It's very dusty. Once you put it onto the surface, you can manipulate it in a lot of different ways. So a piece of charcoal generally lasts for quite a few drawings. So the different types of charcoal result in different types of marks. So there's 3 main types I want us to be aware of for the purpose of the test: the compressed charcoal, the bricks we were just looking at, the charcoal pencil that we started with, and then the one in the middle in this slide is called vine charcoal. And vine charcoal is also superheated wood. In this case, they were literally made of vines originally, so they are cylindrical, very, very, very light, and extremely brittle. So when you look at how they operate, what kind of a piece of paper, you can see the different quality of these 3 tools. Your charcoal pencil is going to make linear marks. The compressed pencil, or compressed charcoal rather, will allow you to make linear marks if you use the edge of that brick, but it's much better at making large patches or areas, as you can see on that slide there. And the vine charcoal also can be used to make lines or patches, but notice that of the 3 of them, the vine really looks the lightest. It's very difficult to get a true rich dark black with vine charcoal. And if you zoom in on it, if you look over on this left-hand side of the photograph, you see all these little black dots and chunks, little bits. That is because the vine charcoal itself is extremely brittle. So as you're using it, little pieces are actually breaking off. It is a very light and very brittle material, and it will leave these little shards or bits as you're working with it. The other thing about it that's kind of odd is that it has a tendency to not cling to the paper as tenaciously as the compressed charcoal. In this slide, I took the same marks that I had made earlier with the charcoal, the vine, and the compressed, and I took a piece of cloth and with my finger rubbed across those surfaces so you could see the effect of trying to blend, to manipulate the charcoal by hand. The charcoal pencil, you see, doesn't blend at all. There's a little smudging and smearing, but not much. The compressed allows me to blend and move the charcoal around a lot, but my vine charcoal really does not allow me to make much in the way of smudges or adjustments or blends. It almost looks like the vine charcoal has completely off in that center section where I rubbed it with fabric. You can see that happening there. So I use vine sometimes for things that I know I'm going to be doing a fair amount of erasing, or perhaps as a base coat. I tend to work more with compressed charcoal throughout the entire process of a drawing, and I might charcoal pencil. In any case, when you're working with charcoal, it is a very dusty material, so fixative is a really important tool to add to your arsenal here. So fixative is basically like a spray varnish. You are sealing the top coat of the drawing to prevent it from smudging. We've already looked at these when we were talking about examples of high key and low key values, but these are student drawings primarily made with compressed charcoal. So you can kind of get a sense now that you've seen the material and you've seen just how it looks on paper, how an artist can manipulate that. You can see a lot of smudging and blending and use of the eraser to adjust in these drawings. Here's one that has been finished with an enormous amount of charcoal pencil to go into the really finer details inside of these leaves, the veins in the leaves, the spaces in between the slats of this overturned basket. There's a fair amount of pencil work, charcoal pencil work being done in this piece. Another technique that you can do with charcoal that I find really helpful is this technique that you see that was used to make this drawing, which we call the subtractive method or the negative technique. So in this kind of drawing, you coat your paper with a dark medium value of charcoal and then use your eraser to kind of sculpt or remove the areas that are lighter values down to the white. So even though it looks like this was made on a white sheet of paper by adding marks, it was actually made in the completely opposite manner. And it does feel a little bit more like the way that a painting looks, because you have a base value established across the whole surface. So how does that work? It starts off like this. So on the left, you see a piece of paper that I've started putting charcoal on. You can see me blending the charcoal together. Now on the first image, I'm using my fingers. You can see the oil in my skin is just kind of grinding the charcoal into the paper, kind of making it stick and smear. But what's more useful is a piece of cloth. So we usually refer to these as chamois. Spelled C-H-A-M-O-I-S. But the idea here is that you can blend out the charcoal, move it around, and kind of soften the appearance of it. Notice that the charcoal takes on the appearance of the texture of the wooden drawing board that I'm working on. So the more layers that I put on, the more that I blend it, the smoother appearance it's going to have. So this is just the first layer being blended. Here I am adding more charcoal to a second layer, to a third layer. Here's the final result. By the time I'm done working with this piece of paper to get it ready to draw on, I've completely covered the whole thing, and I'm somewhere in this range on my value scale. I'm not in the absolute center, but I'm also not at the absolute jet black. I'm in the darker end of the middle part of the value range. These are some examples of how to use the eraser to draw. And so on the left at the top is how most people start. They'll go in and take an eraser and outlines around the outsides of shapes. And I don't find that to be terribly believable in terms of making something look fully three-dimensional. On the other hand, if you look at this drawing on this side, you can see that I've erased out negative space in between this bottle and this overturned cup, and it starts to create the sense of those two objects as being fully three-dimensional side by side. So using my eraser, I can not only carve out negative spaces, I can also very quickly establish a light side and a dark side on an object, and they just look instantly more believably three-dimensional early on in the process. So in looking at on the right was done directly on top of the marks that I made here. I made these lines, didn't like them, took some charcoal and a chamois and rubbed it all out, and then erased these forms right on top of that surface. So the drawings actually took about the same amount of time. This version on the left and the version on the right took me about a minute and a half. So you can see the advantage of that subtractive technique. Here's some student drawings just to give you an idea of how to start these. Usually if you're working in a subtractive technique, it makes sense to get your lightest values established first. So this student is doing a still life that has a human skull in it. This drawing at the bottom right, you can see that the paper is really pretty pale. It's not that medium dark gray. And so as the students started working, they almost instantly had to go in and add some charcoal to those darker areas. So this is a less successful approach than the one on the left. Here is that same drawing from the left after completion. So you can see that even though it begins with these large black areas, we eventually get it a very believable surface. Every area seems attended to. The contours are very believable. So this, I would say, would have taken a student probably about a week and a half worth of class meetings. Figure at least 9 hours, somewhere in that general range to create that drawing. Conte is another medium that we should consider. The Conte crayon is actually named after Nicolas Conte, who is a French art supply inventor who developed this technique of additives that would make it harder and softer. The Conte crayon is different from graphite in that it has, instead of a gum-based binder that keeps it dusty, and has an oil-based binder, and so the Conte really bonds to the paper in a way that's a little bit more like the way oil pastel or wax crayon will stick to paper. It also allows us to get a really deep, rich black value. You can notice in these drawings by the artist Surat that the paper he's working on is very, very rough, and that's preferred when you're working with Conte. So that allows the lower sections of the paper to show through the dark as these little white pops that you see here in this, for instance, in the top of this woman's dress. You can see there's some areas where the white of the paper still shows through. The reason I really like the drawings of Surat is that he doesn't use hard, harsh outlines around the outside of his forms. You'll know him as the painter who did the painting of the people in the park made of little tiny dots that we usually refer to as pointillism. This is his set of drawings kind of in preparation for that painting, and you see that it kind of has the effect small separated dots. But if you look at the edges of any of the forms, you notice that there's no hard outlines running around the outside edges. Try squinting at this screen. See if the objects don't become a little bit more clear to you, a little sharper in focus. I really think that what Surat is doing here by using Conte is more accurately mimicking what your eyes are able to see. Your eyes don't really see black outlines on the outside edges of shapes, but is changes in value from light to dark. A technique that very few people are still using today that really comes to us from its heyday in the Renaissance is called metal point, or sometimes silver point. Metal point is a kind of rigorous technique that does not allow for much in the way of mistakes or corrections. If you imagine what a mechanical pencil looks like, a plastic or metal holder that has a stick of graphite inside of it, and you click it on one end, and that makes more of the material protrude out from the end of it so that you can draw with it or write with it. That's the same concept for metal point. So instead of drawing with a piece of graphite, your quote-unquote pencil lead, in this case we're actually drawing with a wire of metal, usually silver. Now, a piece of silver will actually leave a trace mark on a surface if that surface is relatively hard. So what most artists who do metal point would do would be to cut a panel of wood with plaster and then sometimes a coating of some color. So most people who work in point will work with kind of a pale medium color. The metal lines that they're drawing onto it will darken to much darker lines, and then chalk added to do the highlights. But the metal point lines cannot be erased. So the way that artists would use these types of drawings in the Renaissance was almost to advertise their own skill. You would make metal point drawings for view in your workshop so that to see if they wanted to hire you to make a particular commission, they would see these meticulous drawings. Knowing that there was no chance to erase would show the perfection of your skill. Another material that we use when we turn to the concept of color is the general category of pastel. And pastels can be divided into two main categories, chalk pastel or oil pastel. The chalk pastel behaves kind of like the sidewalk chalk you might have used as a kid. It's quite dusty. It can be blended by hand. Oil pastel, on the other hand, and that's what these drawings are here. These are student drawings done with oil pastel. Doesn't blend terribly well if you physically manipulate it. You would with a chamois with charcoal. They can be blended, though, by using a moderate amount of paint thinner or turpentine and a brush. And so the oil pastel tends to have a little bit more intense saturated color and a little bit more bright richness. That being said, this is a chalk pastel drawing with modern pigments, and those are obviously intense, almost to the point of being gaudy. But you can see if you look closely that the surface looks kind of spotty and dusty. And that's really the nature of the chalk pastel. It is not held together with an oil-based binder. It doesn't immediately stick to it more manipulatable by hand. You can blend it and rub it with a chamois or even with your finger and get it to create a fade from one value to another as you go across the surface of the paper. Turning to our water-based materials, or wet materials rather, this is our drawing ink, and we usually refer to it as India ink. It comes in a variety of different quantities and different manufacturers, but essentially a very dark liquid that can be applied either with a pen or with a brush. I tend to purchase for student use the type that you see on the left, because the top of that bottle is an eyedropper, and that allows you to control how much of the ink you're using. The traditional way of drawing with ink is to use the old-fashioned style of dippable pen, and so the pen holder is what you see at the bottom left, and what we call the nibs are these metal pieces that are inserted into the handle, and on the right you can see different types of nibs create different widths and thicknesses of line. So the hand position here that you see on the left is the correct way of holding the pen. You dip it, you obviously don't need to dip in the handle itself, we're just dipping the nib, and then you're pulling the pen in the direction of your dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, you would start on the left and pull to your right. If you're left-handed, you would start on the right and pull to the left. This is a student drawing. It's one of the Kardashians, I think. We do an assignment often where we take a celebrity face and put a grid on it and then make a distortion of that grid and folds this face. And you can see that the student here is using the stippling technique of creating an area of lighter or darker values by the amount of dots that are being added. The more dots and closer together, the darker that area is going to look. Obviously, we have now modern pens that have ink on the interior. They're not great for the environment, I suppose, because once you've used up the ink, you're going to throw it away. They're not refillable. They do make very expensive refillable pens, but most students find the cost far too expensive. You can see here with the Micron brand design and drawing pens, though, that they are also numbered. You can see that I've used a number 1 here to do this very fine line and a number 5 to do this much thicker line. Obviously, you can use other materials as well. Quite frankly, I use the Sharpie pens quite a lot in my own work, and I will often keep them around as they start to run out of ink so that I have a range of light values to dark values. The technique of making an ink wash is perhaps one of the most interesting ways of making a drawing, and what you see here is my ink with my eyedropper top. I've taken a series of cups and put out the same amount of water in each one of those cups, and then I've added an increasing amount of ink from one cup to the next. So I'm going to start with a very light mixture on this side, work my way over to this side with darker and darker and darker dilutions of the ink. This last cup that you see here is full strength black. Just there for rinsing my brushes out. But there's no formula, there's no perfect ratio of how to measure this out. You just kind of mix them and do it by feel, really. But generally, I increase by a factor of 2 or a factor of 3. So I might put only 1 drop in the first container, and then 3 in the next, and then 9 in the next, 27, and just keep going like that until you have achieved the range that you want. Once I made these mixes, though, I used those separate brushes to paint them on the paper so you could see that it really does allow me to create a very light value to middle value to quite dark. It's odd, though, when you look at the dilutions, they all look jet black. So you really do have to be organized when you set up like this. Very often, if I do this in classroom, I'll give everybody a roll of text so they can write a number on each one of the cups so that they can see which one's lightest, which one is darkest. This is a student drawing on the right, a famous photograph by Edward Weston on the left. So you can see that the ink wash can be applied in layers, and it can also allow you to create really soft gradations or blends from light to dark values. This is a series of drawings I made several years ago that are mixed which is a term that we use when we're talking about using more than one material at once. So mixed media in this case includes charcoal, graphite pencil, charcoal pencil, some white chalk, a little bit of acrylic paint, some ink. There's even a little bit of white used in there as well. In this area on the surface that you're seeing here, what looks like diluted ink wash is actually an effect that you can create with charcoal. If you're using compressed charcoal and a brush with some clean water, you can actually get that to blend and look a little bit like an ink wash as well. So what are the purposes of drawing? This is definitely important for us to think about, not only what are the tools that we use, but why and how do we make drawings. Traditionally, artists didn't really think of drawing as an end result. It was really a step along the way. Especially in the Renaissance, as we looked at the metal point, you might make a drawing kind of to advertise your skill. But for the most part, artists would use drawing as their first step toward completion of an art project in another medium, in another material, especially painting, right? Usually, we think of this as the most important function of drawing, right? As a beginning step toward finishing something in another form. Artists have used it for studies, especially nature studies, to record ideas very quickly, to draw out a design like a blueprint, to improve your skill and accuracy with issues like anatomy and perspective. But really, since the 20th century, people have been using drawing, viewing it rather, as a finished art form in its own right. And in fact, in the student art exhibitions on campus, we actually have for drawing, and prizes are given in that category. So drawing can be used as a fine art on its own. The different types of drawings that we often see in terms of using drawing to make money include drawing editorial illustrations. Now that applies to things other than just letters to the editor in a newspaper. An editorial illustration is a term that we use for a category for a drawn illustration for any publication, whether that is a magazine, a newspaper, an internet source. We're talking about providing a visual image to enhance a written form in a periodical, like a newspaper, newsletter, etc. A book illustration, obviously, is a category in which people have definitely made very successful careers. Especially in America, really, it's a very popular way of using visual art skills and techniques and still be able to create an income, a career. And then, of course, in America, we also have, not that we don't see it in other countries, but definitely an art form that sort of originates with us is the idea of cartoons, comic books, illustrations in that category have a massive sales at this point, and certainly have a huge impact on a lot of different creative endeavors. So looking at, again, reasons why artists make drawings, this brings up the idea of the first step toward finishing a project in a different form. On the left, you can see the beginning idea. On the right, you see his finished painting from that idea. And obviously his idea changed over time. So you can kind of see why that would be useful to do in a drawing, would be to think about what you might do in a material that might cost you more or be more difficult to use or take longer to complete. So a drawing would allow me to make changes, adjust things, rearrange things in a way that's going to be faster and cheaper than making those commitments or changes once I've started with an expensive material like oil paint on panel or on canvas. Definitely doing studies to record ideas, like things you might come back to later. And again, we can see that with Leonardo's work. We talked a little bit about the idea of ugliness in art, and there's a philosophy in the Renaissance of contrasting. To learn beauty, they believed you had to understand ugliness. You can see that in the study to the left. To the right, though, if you look closely, you can see that in this study of the hands of a saint, you notice that there are three hands. Right here where the mouse is indicating is an almost invisible third hand. So you can see that he's just trying to decide on the placement of arms. And it may be that he started with this original idea and then decided he preferred this position, which is why this hand is more finished. But you can definitely see in where to position these things. So it's an idea generating technique. These are also Leonardo designs, and these are more using the technique of drawing for the purpose of making a blueprint or a plan. You can see here that he's actually, at one point in his career, really selling his services, trying to find work by promoting himself not as a fine artist, but as a designer. And he did, in fact, design several incredible functional objects, including changes to city fortifications, the creation of war machines of different kinds. Now, not all of the designs were fully realized, but this one that looks like kind of a flying saucer is a design that he did for a tank to protect troops. You would have your army inside of this armored shell, almost like a turtle, and if you can see here, their weapons protrude outwards. They'd still be able to fight the enemy while being protected themselves. Pretty remarkable idea. He also is known for drawings that would fit our next use drawing to study anatomy. And in fact, Leonardo did dissections of human corpses to learn how the body operates, how the muscles, etc., work on the interior of the body. And you can see his notes being taken in these drawings as well. So why is it important, I suppose, for us to think about an artist developing skill through drawing? But when you look at the difference between these images on the left, Middle Ages, and a similar image by Leonardo on the right, it's kind of obvious that what looks more real to your eye is the way this drapery seems to flow across the lap, over the thighs, and lower legs of a seated figure. The lines that are drawn here in the image from the Middle Ages really just sort of suggest the idea of folds in the fabric, but don't create a convincing illusion of that drapery being on top of a fully three-dimensional object. So one of the things that I think is pretty vital for us in studying drawing and using drawing is the development of skills that will increase the believability of the three-dimensional illusion that you're creating as we trying to make art that's more believable to the human eye, that more accurately records the world that we're looking at. This kind of skill becomes really vital. We also see in these drawings by Leonardo the use of drawing as a almost scientific aspect, studying perspective or proportion, or in the case of the image at the right, he actually used a combination of geometry and drawing to very, very nearly perfectly calculate the distance from the sun to the earth and the size of the moon. So believe it or not, this is a way of drawing literally can be a problem-solving planning stage through studies of perspective, proportion, mathematics. Here's a perspective study that definitely looks like a sophisticated mental process. This is a drawing, essentially a goblet, a wine glass on a table, but rendered in absolute perfect one-point perspective and rendered as a cross contour drawing, almost like what we expect to see done by a computer creating a wireframe model. This is the work of an artist nicknamed Uccello. Another example of the use of studying perspective, this is a student drawing down on the waterfront by the river off campus, and it shows the use of perspective, particularly in the railing along the river walk beside the water. You can really see how that effect of the parallel lines seeming to get closer and closer together as if they'll meet when they reach the horizon creates a sense of three-dimensional perspective. Artists have definitely made careers out of exploiting their drawing skills, and one of those areas, one of those uses of drawing to make a career, to make a living, is the idea of illustration. So believe it or not, are actually, and have been for a long time, artists associated with military service, especially in the United States. In particular, this was more important in conflicts like the Civil War, World War I, as well. But artists would be on site to try to record or capture the activities and to tell the story of what's happening in these conflicts in a way that the camera really, especially in the Civil War, of course, we didn't have cameras that were fast enough to be able to record scenes in action. And what you're seeing here is the work of Kerr Eby. He was an ambulance driver in the First World War and served as an art correspondent in the Second World War. So he's literally recording for us what scenes are to really humanize the struggles that the soldiers are having, and to give us a glimpse into what the day-to-day routine of fighting a war would be in a way that the camera really absolutely would be unable to do. We definitely see people creating editorial illustration as a way of using drawing to really promote an idea, to discuss, or to illustrate an idea. So an editorial illustration is not just limited to the category of the opinion page of a newspaper, letters to the editor, that type of thing. It could be an illustration for any written form, including something for the internet. I suppose you could argue the Google Doodle is an example of an editorial illustration. In these cases, these particular illustrations are caricatures. They are exaggerations of the facial features of famous people for the effect of making it slightly humorous, obviously, but also in on some of the features of their faces that make them easily recognizable to us. Probably the most familiar form of illustration that we experience in America is in illustrated children's books, and there are multiple really successful artists who are primarily working as book illustrators. I picked Maurice Sendak just because I love the Wild Things book especially, but also because he is one of the most successful children's book illustrators in the history of. He is a multiple winner of the Caldecott Medal, which is an award that's given annually for the best illustrated children's book published that year. And so he is one of a handful of people who have won the Caldecott multiple times. If you think of it as being equivalent to the Oscar for the movie industry, then this is like the top award that you could win in America for being a book illustrator. Obviously, another multiple award winner that you're familiar with is Dr. Seuss. And of course, Dr. Seuss was an art student who was told that he didn't draw very well, which is kind of humorous. But he did actually begin his career before he became very well known for his books for children. He was actually doing illustrations for advertisements. He actually was making essentially editorial illustrations for the purpose of selling products. And that's what these are. Don't they look like Dr. Seuss drawings? Of course they do. It's very much his distinct style. But in this case, he's advertising a product. He did multiple advertising designs for the company selling the insecticide, the bug repellent known as Flit. This character almost looks like a prototype for the Grinch, doesn't he? To the left. Pretty funny. There are definitely illustrators who are aimed more for adults than for children, and that's an example I wanted you to see here is the work of Al Hirschfeld. He passed away in 2003, but for decades prior to his death, he was best known for providing illustrations for publications, usually cartoonish style depictions of famous performers, whether that was in the music industry or theater or film. And in his career, he quite frequently became well known for hiding his daughter's first name, her name was Nina, in drawings. It became kind of a fun game to play. If you found an L. Hirschfeld illustration in the New Yorker or in another publication, you would spend a little bit of time trying to locate her name. In this illustration of John Lennon in front of the Statue of Liberty, you can see the name Nina right here as the contour lines on the edges of the skirts of the Statue of Liberty. Pretty cool. This image of Madonna, it's a little harder to see, but the letters themselves are a little more curvaceous, but Nina is formed in her ponytail. There are also, of course, illustrators who do comics and cartoons, comic books. This one, again, is aimed a little more at adults. This is Charles Addams. You may be familiar with his characters for the Addams Family. Sort of fish out of water style humor, in that the characters themselves seem to be monsters, but living in a world alongside quote-unquote normal people like the rest of us. And you definitely can see that here in his illustrations that were published in the New Yorker starting as far back as 1935. Another illustrator who kind of masquerades as being more for kids but is really strictly for adults is Edward Gorey. His illustrations are pretty well known to your generation, I would think, but one of the books that you might be interested in has a very dark sense of humor, is known as Gashley Crumb Tinies, and it reads like an alphabet book. It's 26 illustrations. It's written in a very rhythm and rhyme based style, and it's about 26 little children who all fall into terrible fates. So A is for Amy, who fell down stairs. B is for Basil, assaulted by bears. It's very darkly humorous, but it's done with a very intense level of pen and ink hatching to create the effects of light to dark value. The last big category, really, for the use of drawing in popular culture and as a career, as a way of making a living, would be the comic book. It's certainly a very American idea. And in a way, one of the issues that I think is kind of intriguing about the use of this drawing to tell a story is how much of an impact it's had in recent culture. If you look at the literal billions of dollars that have been spent by the American and worldwide movie going public to see especially the Marvel Universe movies, you certainly can see that this is an area for storytelling that people find really exciting. But the history of the development of the comic book in this country is kind of intriguing. Initially, as in the case of characters like Superman, Batman, the illustrations were fairly stiff. The layouts on the pages were less dynamic than what you're accustomed to seeing today. They were sort of large boxes side by side. But the characters were almost universally very moral and upright and good, and there was a clear distinction between good and evil. And they began, I believe, to be a little bit less interesting to older, more discerning readership. So as young people began to get bored with the characters as they themselves aged into their teenage years, attempt was made to introduce younger characters who would be more relatable. So almost all of the classic superheroes got sidekicks, or so we ended up adding Robin, for instance, to the Batman comic books, which did, I think, provide a way for younger readers to kind of identify themselves as these potential heroes. And so certainly comic book sales increased as a result. And then as we move into the 50s, there was kind of an odd backlash against the comic book, mainly led by the psychiatrist Frederick Wortham, who published a book called The Seduction of the Innocent. And he even testified in front of Congress that the comic books were really a bad influence on American children, that it was completely leading us into all kinds of acts of immorality, but especially was glorifying the act of crime itself, and certainly the implication that there was an inappropriate sexual relationship between these older adult heroes and their younger same-gendered partners was very much the focus of his argument. And so in fact the comic book industry then was sort of forced to adhere to what was known as the comic code, and you can see comic books had little labels attached, or printed rather, to indicate that they had met the standards. And it became much less interesting storytelling. Nothing could be critical of the police in any way. You could not portray certain aspects of crimes. It made the stories much less interesting, and as a result, the sales began to drop off. So then as we move into the 60s, the big revival in the comic book really happened with the advent of Marvel Comics, and of course the characters invented or created by Stan Lee. The reason I think that became really successful in the 60s was that the characters were more relatable. They were not these perfect beings who had no flaws and were completely morally right in all their choices. A character like Spider-Man is easier to relate to than a character like Superman, who is literally perfect. Spider-Man, in his day-to-day life, has job trouble and relationship trouble, and even as a superhero can sometimes be looked down upon by the people he's trying to save. It's much easier, I think, for a teenaged reader to identify with the troubles that Peter Parker has in his day-to-day life, trying to become the hero that he's born to be. So weirdly, the superheroes begin to become almost more relatable for people as a result of making them have some flaws, making them feel a little bit, although they have these incredible powers, making them feel weirdly more human. So that aspirational idea of you, even though you have your troubles and difficulties in life, you have the things that make you feel like you don't fit in, might be the things that give you the power to do something great. That's the whole concept behind the X-Men, after all. So it really is kind of this moment of regenerating interest in the comic book itself that has led to this incredible amount of income and industry around the comic book superhero television programs and movies. So something that was at one time considered to be really degrading America's youth has now come full circle. Been seen as something to inspire people, to celebrate differences, to tackle political and social issues of all kinds. So I think that something that was meant in a way as just simple entertainment has now become a way of commenting on social issues and on helping people to imagine a better future.